One of the things I like to do as a GM is what I like to call meanwhile elsewheres. Now, the term itself is somewhat self-explanatory, but the idea here is to kind of do segues outside of the party's perspective every now and again to give them more of an idea what's going on. Because, see, whenever you're GMing a campaign, by necessity, the narrative is very well focused on the party because that's the only viewpoint the players ever see. So if you ever want to stretch and show something that's happening in the rest of the world, either from terms of the story or in terms of the setting, you have to do something basically like this, the Meanwhile Elsewheres. Now, there are other ways to get little hints and pieces, but you get the point where I'm coming from. It's something I've always liked doing, but it's something I almost never do because, by definition, all of this is out of character information. And for those of you experienced with D&D know that separating in character and out of character is something that even veteran players tend to have a little bit of an issue doing. So rather than, burden the players with having to constantly be like, oh, I don't know that happened or whatever, I usually skip it. It's only with players I really trust that I actually bother to do such a thing. I didn't actually do Meanwhile Elsewheres for a long time, almost the better part of a year actually, until I finally decided to go ahead and implement them. It's a really good system doing an online thing, because normally what I would do in the past is just toss out an email to all the players and with a little snippet, which I'm going to read for you one right here, for example. So, speaking of which, you are quite clear on what it is you need to do. Of course, Great One. Those present lowered their heads and gave an elaborate bow. We have every intention of being accommodating hosts. Acceptable. Disperse. The little ones bowed and scraped again, skittering off, lest they earn his ire. Although in truth his attention was already elsewhere. The storm was both unacceptable and foolish, and had left a crack in his patience. Perhaps there would be a way to convince them via an artificial? It would take a massive power source, though. As he mused, the barest edges of shadow trickled around him, attempting to catch his attention. Irritable at the distraction, he waved them away effortlessly, a chorus of high-pitched shrieks his answer. Fortunately, the augments had started to take, which would assist in the next process down the line, otherwise the other four would pose near insurmountable. To have come this far, to fail? No, I'd rather burn it all first. Now, the best path towards isolating the Ulthoi, that was the tricky part. Even he hesitated at simply waltzing into the hive to cause injury to one of their own. No doubt why she'd been placed there. The ancient queen especially would see him coming. But there are other, quieter avenues to consider, and surely the news of this superweapon ship would tempt their curiosity. No, best to lay wait and hope for an opportunity for now. They'll come soon enough. Moments later, only a few footprints were left remaining on the white sands at the edge of the volcano isle, and, after a moment, they quietly shuffled back into place, erasing the tracks as if they'd never been. So, to refresh you on where we left off, a ship of Nevere make, a frigate type, or frigate class, military grade airship had appeared in the skies over the quarry and had started doing light skirmish attacks on the ground below. The party had been requested by the Ulthoi to assist in the matter and were like, yes, we get to board an airship. So they immediately got on some nearby Ulthoi skiffs and decided to ride up and attack the airship head on. Now, I haven't described airships in 100% detail on these vlogs, but to give you an idea, anything you're picturing as far as, a boat with propellers is incorrect. These ships really have almost no aesthetic design to them at all. They're very functional, they're very blocky, they're very sealed in. They don't even have windows for the most part, because windows aren't something that they actually need. They use various magical... They're actually almost totally dependent on their magitechnological sensors and whatnot in order to see what they're doing. So, now there are entry points, of course. Obviously there have to be. But the question at this point was, where does the party decide to use? And that was the question I posed to the party. And about 40 minutes passed as they debated their various options. Not kidding, it was a while, as they were like, well, Ultimately, they decided that if this frigate was actually going to, invade this area, they would have to land troops in order to claim territory. So they decided to fly to the underside of the ship where the hangar bay should be and wait for it to open or try to penetrate in forcibly if they could. When they were on approach, the cannon fire ceased, and a few of the party members realized that if the ship was truly hostile and wanted to blow them out of the skies, it could do so without effort or, anything. It would just... So the fact that it didn't was curious in its own right. When it yawned open, the hangar bay, they saw there were over 100 battle-ready soldiers literally waiting for them in preparation for what was obviously some kind of an invasion force. After a quick discussion, the party decided they would go ahead and land peacefully and try and see where this was going. These people were of many different races, which isn't that unusual for a Navarre ship, and they all appeared to have an unusual uniform, which they didn't fully recognize, and they all had an emblem on them, which I'm going to describe to you briefly. It had 3 curved claws going down, forming kind of a triangle, and there were 2 lightning streaks on top of it, and it was surrounded by a massive star. The star itself was inside a globe, which showed the continent, very roughly, in it, and it was all being gripped by a massive eagle. A stylized massive eagle. I mention it in this way because no one in the party, nor indeed the viewers, should have actually identified or seen this emblem before, so the party wasn't entirely sure what to make of this. After a few minutes, a Banderling woman approached. She identified herself as a Lorith of Thrasher. She was a commander of this particular company. After a bit of discussion, they learned that the ship, which was known as the Assurance, was here as part of a mission to claim this facility under full, normal articles of warfare from Alluvia. Few things to note. First, they became aware of this facility on February 18th. I mention that specifically because it's the exact same day that the party came here and became aware of the facility. You can determine what you want from that. The party never actually really followed up on this particular plot thread, but suffice it to say, they were somehow able to figure out that this was here the same day that they did. They also found out that Navarre was unaware of the Olthoi being present here, as they assumed this was an Alluvian spot, Alluvian facility, and that the troops down below were, similarly Alluvian. So they had no actual intention to have hostility against the Olthoi, so they're willing to depart peacefully. Now, in the wake of this situation, Zeiss decided to accuse her of being a part of the Directorate openly. Now, as of this point in time, whether it was true or not, any knowledge of the Directorate was completely fully confidential. So the woman, Lareth, immediately assumed that Zeiss was a spy and moved to have him executed immediately. Rory, not really realizing the full implications, leapt to his defense, which meant Rory was now implicated as a spy as well. Now, fortunately, and I mean we're talking a few action points and several very high rolls, Z and Guido were able to talk Loreth down. Basically, they intelligently decided not to try the tact of, no, they're not spies. They decided to say, we will take care of these spies. Let us take them down to the, to the Olthoi, and we will deal with them appropriately. And so that was, they were able to work with that, and so they went ahead and took Zeiss, took Rory, got on the skiffs, departed downwards. The Assurance sent down some medical supplies and some food and rations in order to assist for the people that they had been injuring earlier with their skirmish shots. And then they moved on, heading southeast. Now, over the next hour plus, a few things happened. The very first thing that happened as soon as Coulson got down there was he went and got a hold of an Olthoi communicator, one that was connected to an Olthoi in Alluvia, and he informed that Olthoi of what was going on. By happenstance, that Olthoi was actually talking with several Alluvian officials at the time, and one of them happened to be a member of the military. They were at like a little social gathering kind of a thing. Now, they had some information that there was a airship which has been spotted in Alluvian airspace, but they haven't been able to actually track it or where it was going, so the knowledge that it was at Marblebush was extremely invaluable to them. However, Coulson wasn't told what they were going to do about it, or anything at all for that matter. Next thing that happened was that Guido was out attempting to learn how to pilot one of the Olthoi skiffs a little bit better, trying to train at it, basically, and not really going anywhere with that, but that'll become relatively relevant in a minute. Finally, Rory and Zeiss both were taken into confinement into the so-called holding area, which was actually a really good idea, because they weren't certain at this point whether or not the Assurance's scanners could penetrate the facility. It could be assumed that they didn't, because otherwise they might have seen the Ulthoi on there. But just in case, they decided to go ahead and actually detain Rory and Zeiss just to make sure that they were keeping up the facade. And you never know, they might have actually landed or come inside, who knows. So they confined them there, and the two had nothing to do but to argue, basically. It reached a point where the argument boiled into outright yelling. In fact, it was interesting because I didn't get a transcript of the whole discussion, unfortunately. I'm going to read my note here word for word. They had an interesting discussion that a summary cannot do justice to, and it culminated in Zeiss's angry outburst that Rory was accusing him of being untrustworthy despite all of Zeiss's recent actions in favor of the party. This outburst, combined with the elemental energy that had been flooding through him recently, and his mental and emotional trauma, culminated in Zeiss manifesting an aspect of light, specifically, that he named Advok. Now, a bit of a breather here. For those of you who haven't been keeping track, summoners, in like 99.9% of the time, manifest their first aspect when they are very young. We're talking like 2 to 3 years old. So they have their aspects with them most of their formative and growing years. It is very, very unusual, although not impossible, for someone who is older or grown or adult to manifest an aspect. But usually if it hasn't by then, there's something either keeping it, it's either a faint thing or something has been preventing it from happening. Similarly, it's kind of one of those situations where you either have the ability to summon an aspect or you don't. In other words, it's binary. If you are someone who has the capacity to be a summoner, you may manifest that at any point in your time. You may not ever manifest it. But if you're someone who does not have that capacity, you will never manifest it because you can never actually gain that ability. Make sense? You can't train it, in other words, not like, most of the other forms of magic that can be trained. So him spontaneously manifesting an aspect was kind of an unusual situation. I decided to allow it based on the circumstances and the specific situation, his in-character reasons for it. Now, towards the end of the hour, several of the people who were up above ground, which included, and I quote, Z, Javan, Snarg, Guido, and Higaide, they were all in the Order facility area, or not facility, excuse me, the grounds that the Order had been set up near the quarry. And as they were, attending to the wounded and all that, they noticed that there were lots and lots of refugees, kobolds, gnolls, goblins, that sort of thing, who were all running kind of northwards near them, being chased by Directorate soldiers. They were being knocked unconscious by some kind of a ranged weapon and being taken captive. Now, Higaide tried to get the Order involved to assist them, and the Order literally to a point flat refused. The Order would not get involved in or entangled in political issues. So, no, absolutely not. Snarg was actually almost captured, being a gnoll. It was some quick thinking that they managed to cover him with some Order cloaks, so that the soldiers realized he was a member of the Order and not a member of the refugees. Now, Higaide, who was really pissed off at this whole situation and wanted to do something, managed to rescue one person, a goblin woman named Sally of Silversnap. He brought the woman to the Order camp to be taken care of, but she was near hysterical from the stress of whatever had been happening, and they kept trying to interrogate her, which actually only made things worse. Finally, Guido came by and offered his aura of anti-fear, and she was given some soothing tea, but the result of that, combined with the stress of what she'd just undertaken, meant that she actually passed out. So Higaide carried her back inside to Tia's room. Meanwhile, Z, Javan, Snarg, Guido, and Higaide were all rather curious about what the hell was going on in Marblebush, so they decided to pile into Guido's skiff to head out to sea, and as they were trying to maneuver, the air became unusually charged and strange, as if it was both hot and cold at the same time, and their skin was being pricked by thousands of sharp needles. And then there was this horrible, indescribable, and loud, horrifying sound that set the craft plummeting out of control and colliding with the ground badly. If I might pause for a moment, I kind of wish that I actually was doing this as a game or a TV show or movie or something like that, because this whole section from this point up until, well, something that'll become obvious soon, would be done in total silence, absolutely no audio whatsoever. So, the Order and the Ulthoi, not sure what was actually going on, basically immediately started piling people into the facility, trying to escape whatever the hell was about to happen. Z, for about 6 seconds, started running towards the city, trying to figure out what the hell was going on, stopped as she realized that was an incredibly bad idea, and turned around and started running back. She realized also very quickly that she was not going to be fast enough, as in the peripheral vision she realized there was a sort of black-white lightning cloud behind her, which was expanding very quickly. So quickly that she literally only had time to grab Hagaide and translate into the facility. She would not have made it if she had tried to run. Guido and Snarg had been thrown by the skiff into the quarry, so they were actually close to the door and managed to get it relatively quickly. Javan was further away, but he actually used his jump ability, because he had just recently become a Dragoon, to accelerate his speed and get in. But Coulson had a bit of a problem, because Coulson was up here. Now, I know I don't describe this too well. I'm going to describe this again in a minute where it becomes relevant, because here's the ground level, and here is the entrance to facility. This is a couple 100 feet here. This is the quarry, right, where they dug down and found this facility by accident. Coulson's up here. So Coulson literally decided to fall, just lunge down here, like this, and Guido grabbed him. I made him burn an action point just for the ability to do this at all. Guido grabbed him and shoved him inside as he smashed the door shut, and they pretty much made it with a few milliseconds to spare. Coulson broke both of his legs in the process, and, yeah, it was a bad way. Now, when they were in there, again, silence. Weren't sure exactly what was happening. Still having a hard time actually hearing each other and trying to communicate. Lots of yelling back and forth, which resulted in nothing, of course. Guido used his newfound air elemental powers, an ability known as Defibrillate, to heal himself and the party and a few people who had been piled inside there as the whole area shook, although they weren't sure exactly what was going on. And they quickly decided to get further away from the door and further into the facility. After a few seconds, there was a really loud clunk, like the whole facility just got yanked, 3 feet this way, and then everything kind of went still. And their hearing, at about this point, started to actually come back. So, Sally, who was, had woken up from the shake, wanted to know what the heck was going on. So, Hagaide and Snarg both talked to her about what the heck was going on and what had happened. She described how, at Marblebush, troops had landed from this Navarre airship and began occupying the town, and it was so similar to what they'd been doing in Stonehold that she and all the refugees, which included herself, her husband, and her daughter, began running frantically away. And in the chaos of the retreat, she'd actually lost sight of her husband and had just lost her daughter, who had just been captured, before she herself was rescued by Hagaide. Otherwise, she would have turned around to try and rescue her daughter and been captured herself. Excuse me. So she thanked Hagaide for his assistance, and Snarg assured her without hesitation that they would go and try to find and rescue her family. And then they talked for a bit. Now, this isn't super important, but I like little tidbits like this because this was just pure role-playing. It was just Snarg sharing some of his experiences about living in Stonehold, and they learned more about her. For example, she lived in the southern area of Stonehold, a very wild land that had frequent centaur attacks because that's more of their territory than the more civilized races, even amongst Stonehold. She also revealed that she had and her tribe had a strong relationship with past tense, a strong relationship with a tribe of Pale-Mane Gnolls, who had been in the area and basically taken up the role of protector for this goblin tribe, in exchange for the goblins helping them with weaving and resources and that kind of a thing. And they had this kind of nice little trade setup going on. And there was a few other nice little tidbits about, what they liked about the area or how much they missed the mountains or the rivers, little peaks, that kind of a thing. It was a nice thing. Meanwhile, Rory, who was already drunk because of having been kidnapped here, or confined here, excuse me, decided to go get more drunk. On his way, he encountered a lot of Ulthoi who were acting unusually. He also encountered several very small Ulthoi. I only mentioned that as a brief askance, because it's the first time anyone's seen an Ulthoi that's shorter than 8 feet tall. Meanwhile, Z and Guido both decided that they needed to do something, so they headed for the surface, but at this point in time, the way to the surface was still blocked by an Ulthoi who insisted that only Ulthoi were being allowed out because they still weren't certain what was going on, or how, or why, or if it was safe. So, no. Guido and Z then decided the best path forward would be to go ahead and translate directly to Hive, try to communicate with the Ulthoi, command, basically, with the infrastructure, and say, we need help, we need assistance, we need it now. So they translated, and they encountered Klinsk, there we go, who was actually, I only mention it because he's an Ulthoi that Z has actually encountered several times in the past, so the two actually have some kind of a working relationship going on. She and Guido both used their psionic language ability to info dump all their experiences into Klinsk, and he went ahead and communicated that to several of the other Lancers and Swarmers that were in the area, who decided to go ahead and they informed the group that they would probably be sending help immediately. It wasn't their call, obviously, but the odds were very good that they would send help literally immediately and get down there as quickly as they possibly could. So, you know, that was a good thing. And hopefully, you know, whatever's left of Marblebush will be salvageable as a result of that situation. Now, Z and Guido, grateful, decided to go ahead and use another of their translates for the day, which they're kind of low on at this point, and headed to an abandoned area of the Hidden Vale within Holtberg. However, they spotted a rat, which realized Z was a desolate and moved to attack. Fortunately, Guido crushed the rat dead, and then turned to Z and muttered, "No witnesses." They then tried to get a hold of Ursulon of Prowler. He's the drudge who was their liaison to Lady Lightmane. They managed that pretty easily, but he himself was having a hard time contacting anyone else. It's not like, you know, officials were on lockdown or anything. They just weren't answering or opening the door or letting people in or anything. They really couldn't get a hold of anyone within the military at all. Not sure what was up with that. Meanwhile, the rest of the you know, some time passes, and at about this point, you know, it's been another hour since the shockwave of doom went through, and they're like, okay, the Ulthoi are going to go ahead and allow certain people up topside as they try to determine what they're going to do. So the party heads out, and I mentioned earlier, I was going to mention this again because this is kind of important. Again, this is the surface right up here, right? This is the ground level. And the Inithron's facility's top level, where the entrance was down here, a few hundred feet below. So this is basically the roof, or ceiling, or whatever you want to call it, of the Inithron facility down here, well underground by design. And of course, this massive quarry that digs down in here like this. Well, keep this in mind, but when they exited, Rory actually tumbled a bit and fell down, because ground level was now down closer to here. And the facility was now jutting out completely out of the ground, which I'll describe in a moment, and the door was just here, and you just plummet down to where the new ground level was, which was way down here. The ground itself was scorched to a dull gray ash, and it was wiped incredibly smooth. So smooth it was actually almost liquid to move on. In fact, it was slippery and difficult to maneuver. There were no people, or tents, or buildings, or trees, or hills. It was literally just this slope of ash in all directions as far as the eye could see. With a bit of an analysis, they realized that the slope was just, it was just a little bit slanted so that the downward angle was heading towards where Marblebush was. So, you know, they figured that's where this, you know, the airship was, that's where this thing happened, and they needed to go and figure this out right now. It was really, really quiet, too, like incredibly quiet. The only sounds were from the Ulthoi, who were frantically digging through several tons of ash as they searched for any survivors, or dirt, or anything that wasn't ash. Javan, who was a fairy and therefore has elemental sight, realized that all elemental energy other than the people still there had been completely removed from the area, from the ground and from the air itself, which produced as a result not unlike what the Deadlands were back on Visay-en-Lascelles, for those of you who remember it. Now, they weren't 100% sure what was happening back in the town. After all, they couldn't see the town from here, nor could they see the airship from this distance, so they could only speculate on what was going on over there. But they decided, you know, they probably should go ahead and tell Sally what was going on, because the odds were very good that her people who were previously out in that now crater were not there anymore. So they found Sally, who was sitting there conversing with Zeiss's aspect, Advok, and Snarg quietly informed her of what happened above. Now, Sally actually gave no real reaction. She just was dull, you know, quiet, and decided she was going to go ahead and, try and retreat for a moment. She retreated to the restroom and started crying quietly to herself. A few minutes after this had passed, Snark started to realize that the crying had stopped, and there was no response from the restroom. So he had actually, knocked, saying, "Sally, are you in there?" And there's no response. "Sally?" He busted the door open, and I'm sure you could already guess, but Sally was lying on the ground, blood pouring from her neck, and she was unmoving. Snarg himself basically couldn't handle the situation. He fell into an actual rage, destroying the stalls, the walls, anything he could reach. And about this point, Rory, who was having trouble even comprehending the horror of what had just happened, said that he was in a rage himself, and he's like, "We need to get out there, and we need to go down to that airship, and we need to get that airship." And he hadn't actually thought anything about past the point where we need to go stop that airship which had done this. We need to destroy it and make this over with. Now, a decent period of time passed in between that, which is actually the end of that session, and this next little tidbit, which I'm going to share, and then I'm going to end this particular video on a Meanwhile Elsewhere. But the party was so overwhelmed by the situation, they decided, okay, we're going to need to appoint a quote-unquote leader who's going to start making decisions for the group. And we needed to because we need to coordinate. This is getting serious. This is getting really serious. So they appointed Snarg as a de facto leader of the party, and they decided the best thing to do was to go ahead and, with the assistance of the Olthoi, evacuate the dead zone as quickly as possible and go to check up on the three towns to the southeast, because they had no idea the scale or scope of the devastation. They weren't even sure Marblebush was still there anymore. So the best thing they felt they could do is go and try and see what was going on there. Now, the good news is, as they left, they did reach a point at which ground existed again. In fact, as if you've probably already figured this out because of the way that the huge amount of topsoil had been vaporized, but as they're traveling along this ashen, slick, dead ash, they reached a point where there was a sudden cliff leading straight up, and this is where the ground actually was, and where it should have been, and they had to climb their way up here, and then they were back on grass and trees and other things. Although the whole place was rather violently displaced, and indeed there were a few tree trunks that had been literally ripped and tossed into the crater, but that's otherwise. Based on their information, the crater looked something along the lines of several miles wide. They wouldn't find this out until later, but it's actually something along the lines of 17 miles wide. Or, excuse me, 17 miles in diameter. Or radius. So, pretty large, all things considered. And I'll go over what they do next, because I want to get into that Meanwhile Elsewhere first. Now, some of these names may or may not sound familiar to you, so apologies, but earlier they encountered a dwarf in Holtberg named Bartholomew, and they had actually helped him to get here, and then they just kind of forgot he existed. He was actually being escorted by another member of the party, Ashikel, who was a troll. And so I just wanted to give you a little bit of info there. Bartholomew of Ironforge wiped some of the sweat off of his brow as he looked upwards into the afternoon sky. It was almost cloud-free today, with a light wind that chilled but otherwise made for a crisp atmosphere. He'd been rather enjoying himself, taking a stroll and munching on a Brayburn, when the troops had arrived. The initial hubbub had died down surprisingly quickly. Now only the refugees were panicking. They fled in the face of capture, and the troops were quick to follow. The local authorities, all dwarves of course, were standing in the streets, arguing with a Banderling woman in some strange kind of uniform. Bob gave a mental sigh, and he had been watching them and trying to figure out what to make of it when a sudden shadow had drifted over him. He looked up to see an interesting sight. A second airship was now hovering over the town, this one of clear alluvian design. The two colossal beasts of metal and magic soared over Marblebush for several long, tense moments. No one watching was entirely certain who fired first, but it didn't matter very quickly. Each shot rang like thunder. He felt the reverberations of each impact in his very bones. But worse was the screeching and inhuman sound of twisting metal and thunder mixed in unpleasant cacophony. All throughout the town, eyes were turned skyward. Every citizen, soldier, and refugees stopped where they stood or sat, and universally turned eyes towards the scene. If anyone were able to observe it, this would appear a most ironic sight. In the middle of a literal war zone, members of all races, factions, and loyalties stood peacefully sharing the same fearful glances one towards another and then back up towards the battle overhead, clutching whomever was nearest them for support, no longer able to remember their previous thoughts, no longer caring if the one they clung to was friend or foe. They all shared the same thought, unable to comprehend what was unfolding before their eyes. After all, no airship had ever combated another in known history. The battle was not pretty. The airships slugged it out one with another like drunken brawlers, with no artistry and no grace and no maneuvering, just two titans pounding the life out of another. Bob felt a sudden pressure on his sleeve and turned down, distracted. A young kobold boy was there, clinging to his arm, eyes wide with fear. His heart softened, distracted from his own terror, as he realized what it must be like for this people, so fresh from the assault on their own lands. He reached an arm around the boy's shoulder to comfort him. "Don't worry, son." He patted the boy's hand. The kobold was shaking. "It'll be all right. That's an Illuvian ship up there." Bob pointed towards the longer, wider vessel. "They're here to help us, keep us safe. They'll make sure no one takes you away again, okay?" The boy didn't audibly respond. He merely turned his head away from the sight, burying it into Bob's coat sleeve and digging his fingers further into his coat. He could feel the boy's frame shudder with his terrified sobs, but Bob found his heart actually calming a bit as he had said these words and realized the truth of them. Someone must have gotten word out for a ship to be here this swiftly, and the Illuvian military was second to none. It wouldn't be long before this situation was settled. He could go back to his books, trying to find that lovely Tia woman, discuss some of his new theories, figure out where Ashikel had roamed off to. He wrapped his free arm around the boy, hugging him close, comforting him. As Bob turned his eyes skyward once more, some of the noise began to fade. The two ships had stopped firing for whatever reason. Maybe a ceasefire? The enemy ship began to list to one side, as if to turn, and Bob felt relief course through his body, glad it was over. His face relaxed a bit, and a small smile returned to his features. "You see?" He crouched down with the boy, who looked at him with swollen, tear-stained eyes. "I told you they—" Bob was suddenly cut off by a noise that blotted out all words. The noise was beyond explanation. Having conserved power for several precious seconds, the Illuvian frigate, the Bismarck, launched a myriad of every broadside weapon simultaneously. The barrage ripped into the enemy's hull, and the airship shuddered violently, its metal cracking open as it slowly started to fall. Everyone present could only stand and stare, mouth open, at the sky directly in front of them, the words they had wanted to say lost forever in the moment. The hull breached. Wilpin's fire struck the ship's most vital point. The precious magicite cores cracked open, ripped asunder by Alluvia's magitechnological barrage. Powerful elemental energies exploded outwards. These vast levels of elemental energy were absorbed directly into nearby atoms. The atoms then exploded, overwhelmed by the energy they had absorbed, which was then absorbed and emitted again in lesser amounts, only to be reabsorbed. An explosion that went on, repeating. As this horrifying sound drowned all others out, the expanding sphere, temperature, and air catapulted upwards. Within the first several thousand feet of the now destroyed airship, the temperature spiked to be several magnitudes hotter than the surface of the sun within femtoseconds. The heat does not expand too far, but the initial blast decimates buildings, plants, people, vaporizing everything it touched. The people within this radius had literally no time to realize what was happening or react, their lives wiped out before the image had actually registered in their brain. Nothing could survive this heat, and it quickly became a raging inferno. High-energy neutrons, gamma rays, and elemental energies shattered outwards from the core in a sphere of pure energy. Any of these three could kill in small amounts. The amounts released from the destroyed cores was exponentially greater than had ever been measured before. Within several more femtoseconds, a third shockwave expanded outward from the first two, consuming them in its own nightmare fire and engulfing the Bismarck. This shockwave vibrates its hull so fast and violently that the meter-thick, magically enforced, specially treated Purial hull was reduced to atomic dust within an instant. Amidst this destruction, the cores of the Bismarck fared no better, rent asunder on the molecular level by the physical stress alone. The horror of the first explosion was repeated tenfold as the energy from the first fed into its magnitude. All of these events happened over the course of a single second. The energy released was of such magnitude, it directly touched the 8 ley lines themselves, which served to pull it inwards towards the core of the planet. But as the dozens of energies conflicting one with another roiled in atomic fury, they began to accelerate their expansion and pull free of the ley lines. Slowly at first, but with increasing velocity, the black cloud of white lightning expanded outwards from the epicenter, engulfing everything in its path in a bathed energy of kinetic, elemental, and electronic sort, so powerful that anything caught within was liquefied and then vaporized within milliseconds. Trees, buildings, animals, air, people. As the cloud of chaotic death expanded, the very elemental energy that sustained life itself within this area was extinguished, which caused a greater and greater pull by the ley lines, until finally the strength of the pull exceeded the blast. At this, the cloud of death was ripped back towards ground zero at near the speed of light, the violence of its passing razing whatever was left and obliterating thousands upon thousands of tons of dirt, rock, and soil, until it was all absorbed back into the ley lines themselves. 41 seconds later, there was nothing left. The land stood devastated, a bare and ashen crater, all that was left of the town, the life, and the people that had once stood testimony to the beauty of this place.